with Jonathan Marcus. What do we hear, Jonathan?
Yeah, the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, are saying that yesterday quick reaction alert Typhoon aircraft did indeed, as you say, escort some Russian aircraft that popped up near the Cornish coast. They're stressing that they didn't actually fly into UK sovereign airspace, but they were sort of shepherded away. And this is, of course, the type of incident now. It's very much reminiscent of what used to go on all the time in the Cold War that has become much more frequent over recent months, not just off the British coast, but in close to the airspace of other NATO countries. And of course, there are genuine worries about these flights, not because they're necessarily provocative or so on, although many people would believe that they are, but because in many cases these planes are not using their transponders that send out a signal of where they are. If it's at night, they're not using their lights. And there are very real fears that there could actually be a collision with a civil airliner or something like that. So this is actually seen as a dangerous practice as well as potentially a provocative one.
So why are they doing it?
Well, they're doing it, I think, because this is part and parcel of a policy that Mr. Putin is pursuing now to be more assertive on the military front. He would see this as a response to various Western steps that have been taken. Obviously, the West would deny that absolutely. But I think, what's fascinating over recent days, and I think the comments from the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon about the potential threat from Russia to the Baltic republics, of course, NATO members, is instructive in this direction as well. From what began as a localized Ukraine problem, which clearly strained ties between Moscow and the West, I think the West has very clearly come to the view now that it's not just about Ukraine, that the West now has a Russia problem. Policy in Russia is gone in a direction which is not seen as helpful, frankly, and that people believe that there are going to be difficulties with Mr. Putin's Russia if he carries on this track for the foreseeable future. And that's why NATO is making, some would say relatively modest, but nonetheless significant changes to its defensive dispositions, more rapidly deployable forces, new small headquarters set up in the key countries in Eastern and Central Europe to reassure NATO allies that if there were to be any potential threat to their territory, then the security guarantees that NATO gives, that are the bedrock of what NATO is about, will be acted upon in full.
Jonathan, thank you. I've got a couple of experts to talk about this, but Jonathan, in a way, very neatly encapsulates what we're trying to discuss today, that Russian threat, and whether there's a real imbalance of power now, of military power in that region, and apparently a leader who is prepared to use that power in President Putin. Not all of you persuaded. A texter here writes, Russian planes are often seen close to these shores. It's nothing new. It's beginning to sound like the spin we were fed from Blair and Campbell over Iraq. Here we go, and again, says another. Weapons of mass destruction all over again. This time it's Putin as the Bond villain. Let's hope the public have learned something and won't be fooled again. Well, let's see if we can get some facts. As I say that, I read on the wires that President Poroshenko of Ukraine, of course, has been apparently on the line, has been talking to President Putin, saying, don't pretend that what happened was in line with the Minsk agreement. Well, that much is clearly accepted by the West, if not by Russia. Let's talk to Tim Ripley, a defence and security analyst with Defence Weekly, and Professor Adam Roberts, a senior research fellow at Oxford University, wrote a book about laws of war. Tim, first of all.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Tim. Give us a breakdown, as you best understand it, of the balance of power. Is it right that Russia has indeed been building up its military forces pretty rapidly at the moment?
Well, I have to say, some of this sort of talk about military power and stuff, there's a bit of a Cold War lag here, because, height of the Cold War, 1985, 1990, the Russians had 5.5 million troops, 55,000 tanks, all ready to go, Central Europe, an hour's drive from the Rhine, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That is anachronism. The Russian military is now a shadow of itself, and a large part of the Russian military, Soviet military, has left the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian army, that used to be part of the Red Army, the Belarus, the Baltic states, Kazakhstan, all those countries, so the Russian army, the Russian Federation Armed Forces, are now 850,000 strong, regular full-time personnel, which is actually less than the combined military strength of the European NATO members. But the real issue, you used the phrase regional balance. The real issue is on the borders of Russia, the Baltic states, that part of the world, where the Russian army, and I use the phrase Russian army, is really strong. They have 35,000 Russian paratroopers just outside Leningrad. They're 2 hours' drive from the capital of Estonia.
Right.
They can be there in 2 hours and no one, certainly in NATO, can do anything about it. And that is the regional imbalance that you talk about, where a NATO country is really exposed to overwhelming Russian local supremacy.
Yeah, well, we
So
don't,
when you
wish,
talk
we,
about
we don't wish it on anybody, Tim, but I mean, Estonia is the spot you'd look at if you
Yes,
said
exactly.
there's a soft spot. I mean, so your overall message is balance of power. Yeah, there is still a balance of power. Russia is not as powerful as it was, and the West still has power. But in a particular region
Correct.
next to Russia, we don't have anything like. We probably
Yes.
don't have the will to intervene, do we?
That's more the issue, whether you're prepared to put, in the old Cold War phrase we used to call it, a tripwire. The Polish defense minister has said he would rather have a platoon of 30 American soldiers on the border with Russia than any thousands of F-16s or tanks in his own army, because that is a tripwire that will start potentially a world war that will bring in this overwhelming American supremacy against Russia. And that is more powerful than giving him an extra 500 tanks in the Polish army.
Is it right to say that America still has that supremacy over Russia?
Indeed. I mean, America has, 5,000 fighter planes. It has, 400 ships in its navy. It has 12 nuclear aircraft
Okay,
carriers.
so Putin's no fool, and he would certainly not want to pick an outright fight
Correct.
with America. But it's interesting that when it came to Ukraine, America wasn't even sort of heavily involved, really, was it? It became a European thing, and perhaps that's why Putin didn't feel the need to take too much notice of any agreements that had been signed.
Indeed. I mean, ever since the start of this Ukrainian crisis, Crimea crisis over a year ago, the West has talked tough and said, we're backing Ukraine and we don't accept Russia having sovereignty over Crimea. But are they prepared to, back the Ukrainians to do anything about it? No, they said we don't want to get into a war, which is a bit of a mixed message, which has perhaps sent a red light to Putin to do what he wants within the Ukraine.
So you would expect that his success in Ukraine might tempt him to get involved in other places like Estonia?
Well, this is the issue with Estonia and the Baltic states is, of course, the Russian population in these countries. That varies between 20, 40, 45% estimates of how many are the dreadful phrase ethnic Russians. And Putin has espoused this doctrine of he's the protector of Russians everywhere. And this is the dreadful sort of contrived pretext that he could use in this scenario to say that the Estonians are oppressing Russians within Estonia, and therefore Mother Russia has to protect them. That's the sort of
it is a dangerous
scenario.
game, this, because I know Obama doesn't seem in the mood to get involved at the moment. But I mean, if another country starts to go, the pressure suddenly might grow. These. It's not easy always to control the way other countries react, is it?
Indeed. I mean, this is sort of the argument is put, and I think your next speaker will probably make it better. Is this 1939 or is this 1914?
Yeah.
And the scenario of is it better to set that tripwire and talk tough to face down the aggressor, or are we in a sort of uncontrollable rush to a uncontrollable conflict?
Right. Do you have any opinions on that question?
Me or your colleague?
You.
Me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably. I would say it's probably a mix. There is undoubtedly a good case to make that the Russians see this sort of vacuum of power and are filling it. Now, it's whether they have that. Whether they become drunk on that power and convinced that the West is going to actually draw that tripwire. And
where economic problems play in this as well. Yeah. Sorry, so far you were saying?
So far, certainly the West hasn't drawn a military tripwire in the Ukraine, and they are pushing against an open door.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Professor Adam Roberts, Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University, wrote a book called Documents on the Laws of War. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You'll have heard the debate so far, and what we've done is try to outline some of the military realities. So we come to what are we going to do about all this? So, well, first of all, sanctions. I mean, economic sanctions. We're told that the Russian economy is in deep trouble and they can't go on. Are sanctions working? Do they work? Can they work?
I think there's a lot of confusion about sanctions. They may be working in the technical sense. That's to say they may be having an effect on the Russian economy. There's evidence that they are. But it's a completely separate question whether they will bring about the change of policy that they're intended to bring about. And we've seen many examples in modern times of sanctions that were quite effective in the technical sense, but didn't bring about a change of policy. Most famously,
they just made people angry.
Sorry?
They just made people angry, do you mean?
Yes, I mean, when Iraq invaded Kuwait way back in 1990, in 1990, the sanctions were very effective against Iraq, unusually so, but they didn't change the Iraqi policy of staying in Kuwait, and it required military force to remove them from Kuwait.
So economic sanctions certainly upset Russia, but they won't necessarily make them change their foreign policy, you think?
Well, I think when sanctions relate to an issue which is relatively minor, not absolutely central to the conduct of state policy, then they can be effective. And I think what's happened over Ukraine in the last year is that it has ceased to be a minor issue in Russian foreign policy. It's become a major one. And, of course, there are those who argue, and I think they may be right, that Putin was always deeply unhappy at the loss of Ukraine. That hit him more than anything else. And so has seized this opportunity to recover at least parts of Ukraine. And I think that's where we are now, that in the last 12 months it's become a major issue of state policy to which Putin is personally committed.
What about the next step? So when our last guest talked about Estonia, I mean, do you think, having done it, having pulled off the trick apparently without any great reaction from the West, does he try it again?
Well, I think Estonia is a very different case for a lot of reasons. It's a more, despite its difficulties and its Russian minority and all of that, it's a more stable society than Ukraine was. Ukraine faced the classic difficulties of a new post-colonial state, questions of the constitution, of internal coherence, and all of that, and the frontiers. Estonia doesn't have quite that.
Yeah.
And although there have been signs of Russian pressure on Estonia, there's absolutely no clear commitment to action on Estonia in the way that there is in relation to Ukraine.
So you would, what I'm really trying to get to is whether we should be alarmed and whether we should talk tougher defense moves and whether we should really perhaps not be distracted so much by things like ISIS, but think about Russia as a potential aggressor. I mean, is that where we are or not?
We are in a very difficult situation. That's beyond doubt. And I think what's needed is not a choice between either going down a hawkish route or putting all our eggs in a basket of diplomacy, negotiation, or merely maintaining sanctions. I think what's needed is a combination, which was, after all, a combination that was effective in the Cold War, of toughness, intellectual clarity, and at the same time, diplomacy. The kind of thing that happened in the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. It was that combination. And we need that badly now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's Professor Adam Roberts. There's one other person I wanted to talk to as well before the news. Somebody in listening from Kiev. He's called Jim Davis. He's an American journalist, lives in Ukraine, and I'm interested in your perspective on the way this has gone, Jim. I mean, how do you analyze President Putin's motives? What do you expect to happen next?
Well, first of all, with all due respect to your last guest, having lived with this situation or lived in Ukraine in the former Soviet Union on a constant basis for over 20 years now, I have to put myself in a position of totally disagreeing with the professor. What you have to understand, in my opinion, is that there's always been a feeling in Russia in recent years that somehow the USSR was a good time for them, a better time for them. They're in many ways utterly determined to, if you will, roll back what we consider the gains of the end of the USSR. And quite frankly, Vladimir Putin plays into that. He plays that music very well, and they listen and they like it. And to me, the worrisome thing is, quite honestly, after watching this day in, day out, writing about it, listening to it, examining it, reading the history, I am totally and absolutely without any doubt convinced that the United States, Europe, and what we think of as the free world has a choice. We will fight Mr. Putin and the Russians now, when we might have some advantage, or we will fight them later in a less advantageous situation. I do not think the professor's idea about diplomacy, we've seen diplomacy. Diplomacy means opportunities for Mr. Putin to lie more, and quite frankly, lying has become an absolute tool of quote-unquote diplomacy. He'll agree to anything, as we saw in Minsk. But then what does he do? Something entirely different, and we allow him to get away with it. So at some point, Mr. Obama, Ms. Merkel, Mr. Hollande, and others are going to have a choice. Listening to the lies, call his bluff, and put some boots on the ground and do what must be done to stop this man of what boundaries should be. Because if we don't, the new Berlin Wall will be somewhere near Brussels.
All right, Jim, thank you very much for that. That's Jim Davis, who's an American journalist with the view that President Putin is bent on expansion and indeed has the power to expand into Europe. Although, as we were hearing earlier from our guests, there is a kind of balance of military power, despite our cuts and recent Russian build-ups. And maybe his ambitions don't run that far. But we do come back to the question, if, as Jim says, diplomacy really doesn't count and isn't going to work and isn't going to do anything, what do we do? So I'll come back to my two main guests with that question. Tim Ripley first, and then Adam Roberts in a moment. But Tim, what do we do? I'm going to make you Defence Secretary for a while.
Okay.
That's nice. So, Defence Secretary, what are we going to do about this?
Well, first of all, I think this building up the defences in the Baltic states, which is the sort of Achilles heel of NATO, is obviously a first step. But also to actually build up allies. I mentioned about the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and all these other countries that Russia considers to be they used to call it the near abroad or the former Soviet Union. All these countries that Russia is contesting and wants to dominate or wants to have an influence in. That is the sort of the new arena. They are actually the places where we need to be investing in, having diplomatic contacts with, to build allies around Russia. Because, as I said, Russia has this local sort of perhaps presence in Eastern Europe where it has its ability to do things, but Russia also has its weak points. The Chinese have, they dominate Russia's backyard in Siberia, and Russia has to make Russia look around the world and watch its own back. I mean, if you have alliances with the Chinese and the Japanese, they are a major worry to the Russians. And if the Russians are watching what the Chinese and the Japanese are doing, they can't be causing trouble in Europe.
That's an interesting point. A kind of international coalition. Yeah, thank you for that, Tim.
It's not just NATO, but around the world, around Russia's borders.
Yeah, of all the powers, including China being a key one, of course. Thank you for that, Tim. And Professor Adam Roberts, your last thoughts on the issue?
I think, contrary to the observations of Jim Davis, I think that there is a case for mixing diplomacy with toughness, and I'm not against some of the toughness that he advocated. but we need to ensure that we've got the maximum number of allies in support of whatever we do. And I wouldn't exclude at all that NATO states might start supplying arms to Ukraine, but that needs to be thought out in a context of a policy of supporting Ukraine's neutrality, independence and sovereignty. And we need to get allies in support of those principles.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Interesting. That was Adam Roberts, and you heard from Tim Ripley and Jonathan Marcus, our World Affairs correspondent as well, a little earlier. A massive text on it. I haven't really had a chance to run through many of them. Russian threat. So the UK sees Russia to blame for the unrest. Surely the West backing of a military coup over a democratically elected government in Kiev was the spark. If you tease a dog, it will bite back. Are we forgetting China? Do we want to tangle with them as well? Well, we just mentioned China. Russia's been invaded by Germany twice, France twice, Japan, the UK and Crimea. It's got every right to suspect NATO and protect itself, says Dean. Are sanctions making Putin more desperate? Maybe Obama needs to have a face-to-face with him, try to clear the air, find out what's in his mind. I'd call him up, says Sam. No, interesting phone call. There's no time for weak leadership in the West. A show of strength is required now. Cut off Russian access to SWIFT and shoot down the next bomber that enters our airspace, says a war-seeking correspondent. It's 28 minutes now before 11.
On digital.